Don't touch that dial. You're tuned in to the Dread Podcast Network.
You are now listening to Post Mortem with Mick Garris, where the most influential voices in horror cinema will spill their guts to the renowned horror director, writer, and producer. Now, here's your host, Mick Garris.
From Nice Guy Productions world headquarters overlooking the glamorous San Fernando Valley, I'm Mick Garris, and this is Post Mortem. I always get a delightful frisson when I see an actor or comedian or performer not known for his or her work in the horror genre and discover evidence that they are indeed one of us. Gooble gobble. As a huge fan of the British comedy troupe The League of Gentlemen, it became quite obvious from their self-titled BBC series that these guys knew and loved tales of terror. They filled their episodes with tropes and darkness that could only have come from fans of horror movies and books and television. The episodes of this wonderfully oddball series often dipped into scary storytelling that was knowing and surprising. One of the members of the League, Reece Shearsmith, has already joined us on the slab and professed his love and knowledge of the genre, and we are lucky to have another former member of the troupe with us. Mark Gatiss started out as an actor at a young age, but in 1995, the League of Gentlemen drew attention on stage, winning an award at the Edinburgh Film Festival before moving on to radio and television success. As the members of the League made their separate careers moving forward, Gatiss showed time and again his fascination and passion for sanguinary stories that bond us here at Post Mortem. His appearances in genre shows have been many, but as a writer, he helped reboot Doctor Who, one of his childhood passions. He also, with Stephen Moffat, created the brilliant Sherlock series and delightfully played Mycroft Holmes in the show. He also created Dracula for the BBC, an elaborate and beautiful retelling of the Bram Stoker classic. But his bona fides also include two wonderful documentaries, A History of Horror and A History of British Horror. It's time for us to learn a lot more about Gatiss's love for horror and the impact he's made on ghastly entertainment. Mark, welcome to the slab.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a delight to be here.
Oh, it's really great. I'm a huge fan of your work and the wide disparity between the drama and the comedy and the horror that you've contributed to. I get the feeling you were a really good student at school.
Oh, I'm not sure about that. I was always told, I'm sure you were, and all of us were, as you say, one of us. Well, I was always told I was living in a dream world, and I was always being told to sort of knuckle down and think about more practical things, which I was entirely incapable. So, but I've often said my career is like a log revenge against physical education. And sometimes it works out, you know, sometimes the things that they tell you won't happen do happen. So
yeah, a mind hopelessly trapped in a body.
Donovan's brain.
Now, see, there's a reference that not everyone would get. Donovan's brain, I think it's 1950 or something like that.
That film used to be on TV all the time. It's never on anymore. I used to trip over that film. It was on so often.
So tell me about your early days. What do you think started your fascination with the dreadful, with the otherworldly?
Well, it's very hard to say, isn't it? I mean, I think we can all tell a similar story. It's just a sort of affinity for something right from the get-go. I mean, I saw The Brides of Dracula, the Hammer movie, when I was 4 years old. Wow. I used to think my parents were extremely liberal, and I realized one day with a blinding flash of inspiration that we just had to watch it because it's what my dad wanted to watch. But they didn't mind, and I was hooked from the beginning, and Doctor Who the same year, and anything vaguely supernatural I was drawn to. I used to get a bit cross when things weren't supernatural. You know, you'd watch an old movie and it wasn't the same if it didn't have a ghost in it or a monster or something. Do you remember that movie Island at the Top of the World? Do you know
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, in every respect, that's got a lot going for it. It's a lovely Edwardian adventure film. It's got an airship. It's the Arctic. It's full of eccentric British actors. But in the end, there are no dinosaurs. And you go, yeah, it doesn't quite do it for me.
You
and
felt cheated.
Yeah, I still do. And that sort of thing, that's the sort of template, I suppose, for what I always enjoyed. I was always seeking out something vaguely sinister because it just floated my boat. And it's very hard to explain to a non-we why that makes a difference, but it always did.
Well, in your childhood, so many of us who create or are just fans of the genre definitely were outsiders. We've talked about this a lot with many of the guests. We weren't the prom kings and queens. We were not on the football team. Was your childhood an outsider child that maybe reached for the fantastic as an escape?
Yeah, I wasn't lonely. I remember, I mean, I had one really good friend when I was at school. Yeah, I mean, we were inseparable really, and we had exactly the same things in common. But I wasn't bullied or anything, and I was kind of popular. I just really I always felt, I suppose, yeah, outside in that way. I used to walk around the football pitch talking about horror movies, not playing football, and waiting to get hit in the face by the ball, which of course always happened. And one of my proudest possessions is a school report from when I must have been 7 or 8, and under English I got an A plus, and it says vivid imagination, even if his stories do resemble scripts from Hammer films. An early review.
There was your launch pad right there.
Yeah. But they did. I used to try and manipulate every single story into a horror story.
So you did have a friend with those tastes in common, which is a wonderful thing to have in childhood, because otherwise, I mean, in my case, I didn't know anybody who felt the way I did about these things.
Well, in a way, that's the whole kind of famous monsters angle, isn't it? That an awful lot of people, I mean, of course, now they just find each other online. It's a very different thing, but things like famous monsters linked people together who would never have otherwise found each other, I suppose.
So you found that available in the UK?
Yeah. Yes, I remember. I suppose what I remember most vividly are the covers, because they were so vivid and
the Basil Gogos paintings.
Yeah, it's because they were paintings actually, and in a similar way, I was obsessed with the Aurora glow in the dark kits, of which I only ever had one. I was only ever allowed to buy one, but I used to go every Saturday morning. My mum used to have her hair done, and we used to go to the town centre, and I would be dropped off at the toy shop, and I would literally just stand and stare at them for about an hour until I was picked up with my dad. But I remember that the boxes all stacked up, and that, I mean, the model could never be as exciting as the painting on the cover. I mean, they're just not. They're actually a little disappointing. But I'd give anything to own those paintings, because I think they're pop art classics. They really are so beautiful.
Which one did you have?
I had the Mummy.
Me too.
Did you have you must have had the others though. Did you have the others?
I had just the Mummy because it was a very working class, and I customized it and entered the Famous Monsters contest and won a plaque from Forey Ackerman of the Frankenstein face.
That's amazing. You had the Mummy only. We are right. Our names are similar, I think. Too. We must be twinned somehow.
I told you, one of us. Yeah.
How odd that. I mean, I think weirdly, I made the decision to get the Mummy because my friend who had them all hadn't yet got the Mummy, and so in a stupid way, I decided to sort of best him, and then came home and thought, well, I wish I'd got Frankenstein.
Yeah, but everybody got Frankenstein.
Yeah.
So you actually grew up across the street from a hospital for the insane, I've read.
Yes, my dad worked there. He was a hospital engineer, and it was very. I've sort of spent many years denying its impact on my psyche, but I think probably now it did have an impact on my psyche. I mean, it gave me a very positive attitude towards mental health, you know what I mean? Because I grew up with around a lot of disturbed people, it had a sort of gothic element to it, which I wasn't really aware of growing up. But looking back, I remember my brother and I being left in a ward because I think my dad had picked us up from school and he was still at work, and we were just sort of left in this ward full of disturbed people. And there was someone who had an empty eye socket, and he put his thumb into it.
Oh,
yes, I've not forgotten that. So yes, I would think it's probably safe to say it did have an impact on me growing up.
Do you remember the first story that you ever wrote?
Not the very first, but a lot of them. As I say, I used to write. I remember around the time of that school report, we were given innocuous titles, you know, to write an English composition about something like that. And I remember for some reason wanting to write a werewolf story called Like Father, Like Son. I remember waiting for that, waiting for an opportunity when it was just like, write what you want. But the one I really remember was writing a story called A Day at the Beach, in which they find the family who go to the beach find a head in a bucket. That's probably why I got in trouble. But I got in trouble. This is my version of the sort of the anti-EC comics drive, as it were. I got into trouble because my parents went to a parents' teachers' evening, and they came back, and I was banned from watching horror movies because basically because they'd read all my stories and they were just all horrible. They're all horror stories.
And your father worked with the mentally disturbed.
Yeah, he did enough of work, but I think I said this in the documentary, but it was a very brief purdah, because it was a Friday night, and we used to watch horror movies. Used to be on TV on a Friday night in a special slot, and it was Revenge of Frankenstein, which is it's still a rare Hammer film, actually. It's not a widely seen one, and I was desperate to see it. And my parents came home and forbade me, and I was sent to bed in tears. And then I remember lying there in the dark and then hearing them come to bed. And then I just sneaked back downstairs and watched it with my sister, and nobody was ever any the wiser. So I won in the end.
You won. So when did the idea of performing come into your life?
I guess I've ended up doing the thing I always wanted to do, which is to write and act. And I suppose in that way, from early appreciation of watching horror movies and comedy and just any drama in general, I suppose. I loved television. I loved old movies. There were a lot more old movies on television than there are now. So you were able to get a kind of education. And I suppose I was just very steeped in that and in an education in terms of wonderful actors and directors, and you become, and you by osmosis, you become aware of things, don't you? You become aware of people that you like, or types of genre that you like, or directors that you like, and you know that's what it's all about, I think. And then of course you meet people who will say, oh, you should read this, or you should watch that, and that's how it works. That's how the baton is passed, and suddenly you realize that you've got taste, and you like certain things that other people don't like, and then eventually you find somebody else who likes.
Yeah. When did it first seem possible for you to actually enter that world of entertainment professionally?
I mean, it as a child, of course, it felt very distant, because it was what happened over there. You watched, it was distant land of glittering show business. But I went to a drama school, which is where I met Reese and Steve and Jeremy from the League, and you know, I suppose we all had ambitions, but it wasn't, you know, it didn't by any means mean it was going to actually translate into something, but at least it felt possible. I have a very, very, very vivid memory of Reese seeing me off when I went off to do my first TV job. And I think I was the first of us to do some TV. And weirdly, it was filming in my hometown. But I remember standing outside the flat when the car came to pick me up to drive me north, and it was a big moment. I remember it was like Reese was seeing me off like my mum would, you know.
And so you went to your hometown. Were your parents there to see you do your first TV gig?
Yes, and actually, the strangest part was, of course, I could have stayed with them, but because I didn't mention that I was actually from the place, and so I was put up in. There was a big hotel called Blackwell Grange. It's rather a good title, actually. Blackwell Grange is a posh hotel, but I'd always wanted to stay. So the TV company put me up in there, and then I felt like a prop. I think I felt I made it then. You know?
You were a true actor now.
Yeah.
That's great. Was the Edinburgh Fringe Festival really a turning point for you?
Oh, yes. Gosh, yes. So after we left Bretton Hall, which was the drama college we went to, we all did bits and pieces. And then we formed the League in about 94. And we would do, it was a sketch show, basically, and we would do it live on the Fringe. And then in 1996, we put the best of our material together and took it to the Edinburgh Festival. And we got an agent there, and we got a radio show there. And then we went back the next year with a new show, and we won the Perrier Award, and that kind of changed everything, really. I mean, you know, the thing is, it's never, in retrospect, it all looks very smooth, but there were lots of things in between, but it certainly was a huge turning point in terms of recognition, and then the radio series finally becoming a TV series, and then that was the game changer.
And I love that the TV series. I visited Hadley a couple of weeks ago when I was at the BFI, where Royston Vasey, the town of Royston Vasey, and it was thrilling to see. But what was great about the show that distinguished it from Little Britain or Monty Python or whatever is that it was really dark, and it was a horror show, a horror comedy.
Well, it's a funny thing, this big, because it wasn't like we saw a gap in the market, as it were. It was basically us, and because the four of us had very similar upbringings and backgrounds and a love of horror, it was sort of infused with horror, and also. Horror comedies are some of our favorite things. Everything, you know, from not House in Nightmare Park to Bride of Frankenstein, you know, to Theatre of Blood, of course, principally Theatre of Blood.
Oh, that's so great.
You know, so it was just our sort of sensibility. So it felt natural to have this kind of gothic edge to it, and then obviously, as you pointed out, we packed it full of references to as many things as we could.
But what an opportunity to stretch your wings as both writers and as performers. I mean, each episode, the three of you would each play at least 2 or 3 parts. Yes, I mean, that was a great joy, that. And I mean, you know, acting, everyone gets into acting for dressing up. And this is our first big opportunity to do so. We just kind of, obviously, we went crazy. And then, of course, eventually you sort of start to think, what have I not done? I think in the third series, there are some very extreme looks, because we were starting to think, well, we haven't, well, I played a character with very, well, the idea is the eyes were meant to be like that. Yes. One look, as they say, one looking at you, one looking for you. And because the lenses are actually floating, they actually, during the course of the filming, they would just spin around.
And I was constantly having to sort of try and put them back to 10-2.
Well, those characters were so brilliant, but it also showed you not just as great comic actors, but as great actors, because if you can portray this variety of totally opposing characters and make it real. Yes, you're going for a laugh, but you're going for more than that. You're working from the inside out rather than the outside in, which I found fascinating.
Well, you're very kind. But yeah, I mean, there's also I like, what I really like is there's a strong element of pathos in it. There's a lot of the characters like Les McQueen or Mickey. It's rather tragic, and
Mickey in particular, Les and Mickey both are just your heart breaks for them.
Well, that's what we like to do, I suppose. That's what we enjoy doing, and I think that's hugely down to the sort of comedy we liked growing up. Had at its heart that kind of element. You know, they always say about the best comedies are about trapped people, and there are some really very moving moments in some of the funniest shows, Steptoe and Son and Hancock and Porridge, and you know, there's even in Fawlty Towers.
Yeah,
there's an incredibly strong element of, I think, that the fact that Basil and Sybil were obviously at one time in their life a love match, and something in a kind of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf way has gone terribly wrong. But you have to, you know, there's a wonderful bit where Sybil says something like, "What are we going to do, Basil?" He says, "Give it another 10 years." It's so bleak.
10 more years of that. Yeah. Well, what was the first time you played a straight role that was not comedic? It was a straight dramatic role.
That's a good question. Well, my first TV job, as I say, I was playing the manager of a burger restaurant. So that was, I suppose. Yeah, I did. I suppose it's always been a bit of both. In fact, I've just been filming in New Zealand and Time Bandits. In fact, the new series.
Really, a remake of Time Bandits?
It's a series. Yeah, Lisa Kudrow is the leader, and I had a fantastic time. But it was so silly that I felt slightly off the leash. I thought, you know, I haven't been this silly for a very long time, and it was quite liberating to just kind of go, well, let's see how this sticks. It was so much fun and so liberating. Yeah. So, but I've always enjoyed, you know, mixing it up. I'm playing John Gielgud next year at the National Theatre, and in a very serious play. Well, it's a great, I think, about John Gielgud directing Richard Burton's Hamlet on Broadway in 1965.
Oh my God!
So it's great to mix and match, definitely.
It is. And as someone who always guided his own career as a writer and a performer, how does it feel to have the luxury of not being responsible for anything but your performance?
Oh God!
As a hired hand.
It's underrated, that, isn't it? I think I have many times the relief of being able to close the door of your trailer. A couple of years ago, I'd been directing something and producing something, and then I did a filming job, a historical job, and I remember looking around, and the producer was kind of ashen with stress and was constantly on his phone. And I remember just actually deliberately just closing the door of my caravan and just going to sleep, thinking it's nothing to do with me.
You didn't want to share in that at all.
No, I had enough of that. I felt his pain, but I didn't want to share it.
Well, one of your earliest passions was Doctor Who. And then many years later, here you are writing 4 Doctor Who novels and kind of responsible for the reboot of Doctor Who as a writer, and you performed in it as well. But tell me how that happened and how that must have felt for you.
Oh, well, you know, there's a thing, isn't there, about smelling the flowers, as they say, and trying to appreciate. It's only when you look back you go, God, that was a moment, wasn't it? And that was a moment. You Doctor Who came off the air in 1989, and I wrote a couple of books. But I suppose I don't really think I thought it would ever come back. And then suddenly everything changed. And I remember getting a phone call from a friend of mine saying, "Are you sitting down?" I said, "No, I'm in bed." And he said, "Doctor Who's coming back. Doctor Who's coming back." And it was extraordinary. And then the next day, I've forgotten this. The next day, I rang someone else to tell them, and that was David Tennant. And I remember, because David, obviously, as you know, is a huge fan. And I remember I'd left a cryptic message, and he rang me back, and I said, "I can't tell you now. I'll have to." And he was desperate to know. It's so weird, isn't it? But it was, anyway, it was an amazing moment. So I knew Russell T Davies a little, and I wish I could remember. Isn't it funny? You actually do forget the sequence of events. I'm pretty sure I had somehow been sent or had access to the story document, and it said episode 3 was called "My Name's Dickens, Charles Dickens," and it was basically a ghost story set in Victorian Cardiff.
Oh, who's the right guy for that?
And then at Christmas, it was Christmas 2003. Yes. Russell just rang me up and said, would you write this? And so it was obviously the best Christmas present I could ever imagine.
Oh, and Dickens as well.
Yeah, Dickens as well. Yeah. And then it sort of became, after that, they started doing Christmas specials, and that it's sort of now the sort of unofficial first Christmas special. It's the most Christmassy one you can imagine. And then I wrote, I think 9 or 10 episodes over the years, including An Adventure in Space and Time, the story of how the program was created, which was an absolute definition of a labor of love. I wanted to do that for as long as I can remember. I just always remember thinking the origin story, as it were, is so beautiful. And I had a book when I was a kid called The Making of Doctor Who, and it was very much responsible for me wanting to get into being a creator, because I love the nuts and bolts of it. I love the show and I love the fiction of it, but I remember finding the behind the scenes quality of it also very, very interesting.
Well, it's great to be able to pay tribute as a part of the team that created Doctor Who. But your paying tribute is something that also was behind your documentaries about the history of horror, they haven't been shown in the States, but they're wonderful. I used a VPN to watch them
quite right.
online, and they're just brilliant. Tell me about the motivation for that, and then after that, the motivation to do specifically British horror.
But you know, the strange thing was, I was approached out of the blue by a team from BBC Bristol, and it was like, do you want to do an exhaustive 3-part history of horror films? To which I said, yes, I do. And the odd thing is, I can say this to you, I think, I had slightly lost the feel for horror. I felt out of the loop. I remember thinking that when I was first approached, I thought, well, I don't really know much about modern horror films. I felt like I'd sort of got out of the loop a bit. But obviously, because it was talking about old horror films, I felt in a very secure place. So the first thing I did was ring my friend Jonathan Rigby, who is one of the world's greatest authorities on Gothic horror, and I said, "This should really be you, Jonathan, but we must make this thing together." And our starting point was we did a massive sort of 4-hour interview with the producers, where we just talked about horror, about all our memories, about everything we knew about Hammer and about Mario Bava and about everything, as a sort of, and that's why I think it's fueled with proper passion, because it's about how our access point to horror, as it were, as you were saying earlier, about how you grew up with it and what we loved about it and what we found funny about it, what we enjoyed about it. And so it was that hand in hand with an amazing, rare opportunity to get to some people just in time. I think doing it when we did was the last opportunity to get some people. And if you know the Kevin Brownlow series, Hollywood.
Oh, fantastic.
And when I remember watching that as a kid in 1980, and I couldn't quite get my head around the fact that he was interviewing Ruben Mamoulian.
Oh,
you know, and yet, and now you look at it, and it seems even more extraordinary. You've got Frank Capra being interviewed in these massive 70s collars and things like that.
yeah. I got to sit next to him at an Academy Awards dinner when I operated R2-D2 in 1978.
Oh my God. Well, there we are. One handshake from Napoleon, aren't you? That's how it is. Yeah. But I felt that with, I spoke to Gloria Stewart on the telephone in 1993 and sat outside her house. And this is before Titanic. And she didn't want to be interviewed because she thought she was too old and no one was interested in her.
Oh.
And I remember sitting outside this house in the suburbs of Los Angeles, and she had this garden wall with a green door, and I just wanted to go through the door. And then 17 years later, when she was 101, I went through the door and interviewed her. Wow. And it was just extraordinary. So that and getting to all these amazing people, and John Carpenter, that was, I loved the John Carpenter interview. He was so funny. And I remember he said, I said, I wish you'd make a Western. I'd love to see a Western. He said, oh, sure. But, there comes a time in life when you have to put your feet up and watch some basketball.
That is John. And John is the most no bullshit guy I've ever met. Known him since Halloween. Yeah. Oh,
wow. Yeah. It was such a joy. And what it did was completely reinvigorate my love for horror films. And also because it was like a blood transfusion. And also I discovered things about films that I knew very little about. I suppose the key was what we had access to when I was a child was very limited. And I knew some films only as still photographs,
from famous monsters and the like.
Yeah, and that went for a lot of rare, obscure old films, but also, Mario Bava and stuff like that. I mean, I think I'd probably at that point only ever seen Black Sunday, because there was no access to them, and suddenly it changed my palette, as it were. I found a lot of the films that I'd loved as a kid, you slightly leave behind you, and you go, actually, no, look, this. I think personally, as much as I loved Hammer as a child, I think Mario Bava, taking inspiration from them and then going somewhere, he goes somewhere much more interesting. I think, you can. I was thinking if you look at films like The Gorgon or those mid '60s Hammer films, they're quite stodgy. They look lovely, but you kind of go, ooh, and then you watch them and go, actually, it's a bit boring, this.
Yeah,
and then
they kind of got away from their original frisson.
Yes, I think so. But if you watch a film like The Whip and the Body or Blood and Black Lace, and you just go, Christ, these are properly transgressive, aren't these? These are weird, these films.
Well, there's a lot to be said about being transgressive in the arts, particularly to distinguish yourself from the pack, but also to make metaphorical points.
Yes, and I think that's horror's great duty. Horror is not cozy. It's not safe. It shouldn't be. It's at its best, I think it does something extraordinary, really, in terms of you can make satirical points. You can make social commentary through horror. It's a fantastic medium for that. I think you look at a film like Get Out, and by using the genre, it manages to make a very, very strong point that you would, if it was done in a slightly more restrained way, it would just be yet another sort of slightly dull film about.
Yes, guess who's coming to dinner? Yeah.
But yeah.
There seems to be a very wide gap between horror in the UK and horror in the US. The UK, first of all, has a much longer history, and the Gothic past and all of these ghost stories, a tradition of ghost stories that goes well beyond Dickens, to Shakespeare. And the US is much more, the studios make them for teenagers. They're slasher movies, and they're much more instant gratification kills. But your documentary about a history of British horror was very specific and I think even more passionate for you. It just felt like this love of British horror. Yes, you included all the roots in the American horror films as well, but it seemed even more personal to you.
Well, I suppose it's I did. So the first one is, it's called The History of Horror. The second one is called Horror Europa, and it's essentially about the European experience.
Right.
And
Sorry.
No, that's all right. It was a commission we never thought we'd get, because God bless the BBC for doing something so extraordinary, a 90-minute one-off about European horror movies. But yes, in a way, I suppose it is, because it's the roots of it all. And I suppose ghosts are my favorite things. I've just done another ghost story for Christmas for BBC, and it's an incredible tradition to be part of. And I suppose I do respond most to that kind of European sensibility and that legacy, I guess. I'm sure you will have seen that fantastic documentary about folk horror, which is on
yes, that Kayla Janice did.
Yeah, it's terrific. I watched the first 10 hours and then I had a break. It's fantastically detailed. I was just writing down movies that I'd never heard of. But what's wonderful is that it makes a really great case out of the fact that the bulk of it is about Britain, because the folk story tradition goes so far back. But then what's really fascinating is basically the idea of the American transplant and what that means, I think. That into Salem, and then it becomes a much more sort of it's a different kind of Gothic sensibility, isn't it? But it's always got its roots back in the old country, or it's about the taint of Europe, isn't it? In a way, it's about some sort of I love all that. In a way, it also goes back to that. The central thread of Dracula is that he says, "I long to stand in the beating heart of your modern city." His old country is dry, desiccated, and dead. He's basically starving to death. He says, and he needs to go somewhere new. And I think that's it's a great metaphor for the sort of migration of horror around the world.
Yeah,
it does that. It flourishes in a place and then it moves on, and then you get a whole new sensibility.
Yeah, horror in the US in the 70s really blossomed with metaphorical horror, and with people like Carpenter and Tobe Hooper and William Friedkin really doing something specifically American with their stories that don't go back to the Carpathian Mountains and the like, but are very internationally consumed, and that became the standard for horror, while Scrappy Little Hammer made all their great things. And when they tried to be influenced by the American horror movies that were so successful, they did seem much more stodgy by comparison.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it's something to be very proud of. I think it's a uniquely American tradition, and then it becomes, I suppose, recognizably so. And then of course, like everything, it can become slightly parodic, because you know that if you drive your car into the wrong bayou, there'll be someone there with a scythe waiting to get you.
Welcome to Royston Basin. I would love, you brought up Dracula, and I would love to talk to you about that and the process. How that was, that your conception, or the BBC wanted to make a Dracula and they came to you, or it was something
the most extraordinary thing is it started as a joke. We were making the third series of Sherlock. We'd literally been filming for a day or 2 days, and it was the episode where Sherlock supposedly comes back from the dead.
Right.
And I had a photograph on my phone of Benedict Cumberbatch with his collar up in silhouette. And Stephen and I were sitting at a table in this awards ceremony, and we showed it to the then head of drama at the BBC. I said, "It looks like Dracula, doesn't it?" He said, "Do you want to do it?"
Wow.
That's how it started. Now, then it wasn't an instant thing because we were still making Sherlock, but we kept bringing it. It kept coming up, and then when we decided to stop doing Sherlock, we said, "Well, we'd love to do it if you want to do it." So that's how it happened. So it took about 3 or 4 years to actually come to fruition, and then Stephen and I reread the book again, and having both been childhood fans of it, I guess, and thought, if we're going to do it, what are we going to do with it? And we had all kinds of ideas. I remember having a very exciting lunch where the original idea is we were going to do the novel in one episode. It's like the tightest 90-minute version ever. Then the middle one was going to be set in the 1970s. And then the third one was going to be modern day. And then as we talked about it, we thought, no, actually what we can do is we can spread the incidents of the novel over 3, but just change when they're set, and then have this big twist at the end of episode 2, spoilers, that he's actually been asleep for 100 years and we haven't noticed in the interim, But, sorry.
No, I'm just saying it's fantastic because there's such a long history. Dracula being one of the most adapted characters in film history, next to Sherlock Holmes, which we'll get into. But to be able to bring something new and fresh, and the casting process, Claes Bang, is that how you pronounce his name?
Yes.
Tell me how that came about. I'm curious to see, did he come in and read for you? He was somebody you'd seen on stage or in another film?
We the casting director, we drew up a very long list, but what we'd said from the beginning is, let's try and find someone, this sounds ridiculous, but let's try and find someone about 45 or 50 that no one's ever heard of, and hopefully not English, because that's what we wanted. The Philip Saville, Louis Jourdain version is one of my absolute favorites, and it's so good. And what's brilliant is that Louis Jourdain is defiantly French, but what he is not is British. He is other. He has an amazing foreignness. And so that was our brief, really. And then amazingly, Kate Rhodes James, the square, the film The Square. Is it The Square or The Circle? I can never remember. Is it The Square or The Circle?
Yeah, The Square. Yeah,
it is The Square. What's The Circle? The film. The Square had just come out. And I remember she'd ring Place's name and said, I think this guy is very interesting. And we watched the film, and you just kind of go, well, look, it's either Dracula or James Bond, or possibly both. And so we went out to Denmark to meet him. And that's how it happened. But I mean, it was exactly that. That's what we were looking for, was this sort of an unfeignable otherness, and that's what he has, as well as being devastatingly handsome and charismatic.
That always helps. He is supposed to be seductive, after all.
Yeah, indeed. So, but I mean, the big thing for us was, and I think this goes for everything, especially like as with Sherlock, where you're if you briefly get the keys to Baker Street or Castle Dracula, then and it is something that has been done a lot, I think it's beholden on you to sort of go, well, what's our take on it? And actually, some of my least favorite versions of both stories are the ones that are sort of rather dryly respectful.
Right, right.
I mean, Conan Doyle famously laissez-faire with his great creation, and when they wanted to make a stage play of Sherlock Holmes, and oh God, what's his name? I'm going mad. Who was playing Sherlock Holmes? We'll have to edit this out because I can't remember. Not Elena. But he sent a cable to Doyle saying, "Do I have your permission to marry Sherlock Holmes?" And he wrote back, "You may marry him, murder him, do what you like with him." And that's the creator, you know. So and with Dracula having been done so many times, it was like, well, this is a really good pop. This is a really good pop classic. But so much of it is wonderful, irreducibly great. You know, the Castle Dracula stuff, but some of it is quite stodgy and rather dated, and Dracula is missing for lots of it, and so you know, I think it's fine to do a take on it, isn't it? And actually, interestingly enough, for the middle episode, we both, without any consultation, having read it again, said the captain's diary on the Demeter is such a brilliant idea. What maybe we could do that for the whole episode, because actually, you know, I'm surprised that Stoker didn't make more of it, because it's a fantastic trapped environment with a monster on the loose.
Yeah. Well, what were your favorite portrayals of Dracula? What were your favorite Dracula movies? Coppola or Bela Lugosi? Or...
well, I mean, growing up, obviously, it was Christopher Lee was my Dracula, and I love those movies. I think he was famously hated being associated with it, and
I interviewed him a couple of times back in the day, and you know, The Wicker Man was what he wanted to be thought of for, not for Dracula.
But he's good, you know, he's great. And the two that stand out for me, the first one I think is marvelous, and the ending of the 58 Dracula is an astonishing piece of work. It
still holds up beautiful. That effect of the crumbling in the sun.
Yes, I mean, it's better than effects they were doing 20 years later. It's beautiful and really powerful and sad, and exciting. You know, it's proper Douglas Fairbanks stuff, isn't it? As Peter Cushing always said.
Yeah.
And also, my other favorite, well, I love AD 72. You see, that's my guilty pleasure. But he does for all his complaining, he brings incredible dignity to it and a real power. There are moments when he looks kind of feral and genuinely scared. He doesn't look like a man in a cloak with fangs. He looks like an animal, and he's really great at that. I think he's a very underrated actor. That and the Louis Jourdan is one of my other favorites. And Max Schreck, obviously. I love I mean, I've always Lugosi is problematic because it's very hard from this distance to see why it had that effect. Except, I suppose, in a sort of Valentino way, he's a very good looking and very persuasive, sexy man.
Yes, in 1931 terms, yes.
In 1931 terms, yes. But the Spanish language one is a much better film.
Yeah.
And I feel, obviously, everyone feels sorry for Lugosi because you can see from Son of Frankenstein how good he was.
Mm-hmm.
But he was rarely given the chance, and it's a real shame. It's a very sad story, of course it is. But he's just not in the same league as Karloff. Karloff was a great actor. And
his acting would stand up in a modern film today. Yeah. It was so subtle and beautiful.
I think James Whale genuinely picked him because of his startling possibilities of his face. But actually, luckily, he was a brilliant actor.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's go to Sherlock Holmes, perhaps the most adapted literary character in film and television. Yes. How did that come about? Because you absolutely had an entirely new take on Sherlock Holmes.
Well, not entirely new, and that's how it came about. Stephen Moffat and myself, we were working in Doctor Who, and we were always sharing a train back and forth to Wales, and we would talk about our other enthusiasms apart from Doctor Who, including James Bond and all kinds of things, and Sherlock Holmes, obviously. And it took us a little while in our long friendship to admit to each other that the Basil Rathbone, Nigel Bruce films were our favorite ones.
Yeah.
And of course, because they were in their day heretical, because they updated it to the Second World War. And then this is absolutely true, although it sounds like a scene from a biopic. This is absolutely how it happened. We were in a carriage. In my imagination, it's like the Sidney Paget illustration, where they're sitting on either sides of a carriage. And of course, this was about 2007, something like that. So we were in the middle of an Afghan war, and I said, "Isn't it odd that in the Study in Scarlet, Dr. Watson is invalided home from the Afghan war, and we're in the middle of a new one?" And we both looked at each other, and that's in the biopic, that's the light bulb scene. And we said, "Oh, someone should do that." And then remarkably, we did nothing about it until Stephen absolutely casually mentioned it to Sue, his wife, who happens to be a great TV producer. And she said, why aren't we doing it? And then we took it to the BBC, and it was the easiest pitch ever. They literally said, "Modern Sherlock Holmes, yes." That was it. Because, of course, it's the most recognizable character in fiction, and it's not expensive if it's modern day. So it worked in every level. Then what we did, which was really the most fun, was we sat down and worked out how that would work and what it meant in terms of basically two men sharing an apartment above a curry house or something like that in modern day Baker Street. They wouldn't call each other by their surnames. Sherlock Holmes wouldn't smoke a pipe, but maybe he had a nicotine habit and became a 3-patch problem and all those sorts of things. So there were the equivalences were so much fun, and then some of them were quite sticky because we had to think, well, the character essentially invents modern day forensics, but now everyone does that. So how do you think past that? For instance, we made a pilot, which is very good, I think, but it was when the show was going to be an hour long, and then we got commissioned to make them as 90-minute episodes, basically movie length, and we remade the pilot. And one of the decisions we changed from the pilot was when he's called to a crime scene, he has to put on the paper suit, like they always do. And he looked silly because he's Sherlock Holmes. And then when we remade it, someone offers him the paper suit and he just kind of looks at them. Because what you want is Sherlock Holmes to be in his big coat looking amazing.
Yes, yeah.
So it was things like that, which you have to think, right, he's different he's not just a policeman, he's different to them. Inspector Lestrade does all the DNA and everything, but Sherlock Holmes is the man who says, but don't you understand?
So you confront all of those things head on that come up.
Yes, and that I think is one of the keys to its success is being bold with it. I think that holds true for everything, really. If you're, I remember Jonathan Miller talking about his amazing 1966 Alice in Wonderland. If you've seen it, it's an extraordinary piece of work. It's beautiful. It's a movie by Ravi Shankar on a sitar, and it's got these fantastic British character actors in it. But it's a proper trip. It's the most 1966 Alice in Wonderland you could ever imagine. But he said, if you love the story, read the book. But if you're going to do something with it, do something with it.
Yeah. Well, you definitely did something with it. Did you go back and read all of those?
Oh, well, I know them backwards. So what we would always do if we got stuck was go back to Doyle. And I think one thing I'm very proud of with the show is there was a lot of people wanted to adapt our stories, and we said no, just go back and read Doyle. And I love the fact that a lot of people didn't realize how much of our show came from the original. They thought we were being clever, and in fact it was Conan Doyle who was being clever.
Yeah, I remember reading all of them as a kid myself and just being entranced. Again, you had an actor who is known for that role. You made him a star with Benedict Cumberbatch. Tell me how that casting process came about.
Gosh, well, that was an interesting thing. I'd done a film with Benedict, and then a couple of years before, and then he was in Atonement, and Stephen and Sue had just watched that. And I remember this is another scene from the biopic which will never happen. Our texts crossed, like when you speak at the same time. And literally, I said, "What about Benedict Cumberbatch?" And he sent me one saying, "And we just seen Atonement. Do you know Benedict Cumberbatch?" Was like, that might be. So we had a very long list, but everything just seemed to be right about where he was in his career. That he was a respected stage actor, but wasn't a household name. But he was on the cusp of something, I guess. And,
yeah. Well, you threw him over the precipice.
Yeah. Over the Reichenbach fall.
So you also had a very meaty role yourself as Mycroft Holmes. So tell me about that experience.
Well, when the decision was made to make 90-minute episodes, we had a sort of game plan for how we would introduce various parts of the canon, Moriarty, Mycroft, etc. And by doing movie length things, everything sort of was pulled up, and so we were going to introduce the idea of Mycroft later on, and then suddenly it became into episode one. And I just auditioned to play a British politician called Peter Mandelson, who is a very Mycroftian figure, a sort of eminence grise, behind the power behind the throne kind of figure, and who is known as the Prince of Darkness over here. And and it just sort of fell into place. Stephen and Sue said, "You should do it." So I went, "Oh, very well."
You didn't take much convincing. Yeah. So this Sherlock was, I would guess, your first international huge hit, including the United States. Did it feel different to you?
Yes, I mean, it was the night the first episode went out, and it was scheduled in the middle of the summer, which is traditionally a death slot. Something happened literally as we were watching it. We were monitoring the response on Twitter. I think Benedict became a star overnight, which is something that's not really supposed to happen anymore, but it did happen, and the whole show became a phenomenon overnight. So, but you know what it is, you can't bottle that stuff. It just happened. Something aligned, or everything aligned, and it was the right moment for Sherlock to be modern day, and it was the right moment for Benedict and Martin and for us, and it just boom. And so yes, and then obviously in terms of international profile and an international hit, it's like nothing else. Absolutely. I've just worked with the great Nick Offerman from Parks and Rec,
Yeah.
And, oh my God, I was in awe, and he just went, "Well, but you're Mycroft Holmes, man." And that was a moment.
Well, we need to wrap it up pretty quick, but I would just love to hear about your thoughts about the evolution of horror over the decades. I mean, starting with the silence, and you've got Universal in the 30s and 40s, 50s, giant science fiction bugs, radiation. Then along comes Hammer through the 60s and 70s, and just the evolution. What are the eras of horror that most appeal to you and most give you the excitement? I know you started with the Hammers as a kid.
Yeah, but they used to show them in double bills. There was a Universal and the Hammer, so it was a perfect blend of black and white and color. Literally, it was like sort of Wizard of Oz effect,
Wow.
But I think what I like to think is that I'm very interested in what happens next. Since I made those documentaries, and I say it really reinvigorated my love of horror films, I really like trying to keep ahead of the curve rather than falling behind it. Yes. And although you can be very nostalgic for things you grew up with, I also think it's great to discover new things, and equally discover new things from the past. I'm very keen these days on the idea that you don't have to be held to the list you drew up when you were 14. You can actually say, I mean, there are films like The Thing that are just irreducibly stone cold brilliance. And, you know, there's a reason you go back to them and go, wow, this is just as great as it. It's even better than it ever was, you know. And then sometimes you can watch a film and think, actually, that's really not the way I remembered it. But it's, as with that wonderful folk horror documentary, you just go, well, I've never heard, I thought I knew them all. And, and you go, where's that been hiding? You know, especially internationally. I think that's the really exciting thing, is the idea of horror migrating to a new place and making traditional tropes come up fresh. I think that's a really exciting thing to do.
Yeah, there are more points of view in the horror genre than there ever have been. And I love that explosion.
Yeah. And from some countries which don't really have a tradition of it, are now exploring their own folk stories and their own traditions. And also just the setting being new instantly makes it feel different.
Yeah, from a different cultural outlook is exciting. Well, Mark, I thank you so much for spending time. I'm a huge fan of your work, and I really appreciate getting to know you.
Thank you, mate. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you for listening to Post Mortem with Mick Garris. Download new episodes every Wednesday or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Post Mortem with Mick Garris is produced by Mick Garris and Joe Russo. Our sound engineer is Christopher Leon Price. Our announcer is Jeff Gelb. Our graphic designer is John Holland. And our theme was composed and performed by Bill Burney with additional music by John Jasensky. If you're enjoying our show, please take a moment to rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening to the Dread Podcast Network.